Aloha and welcome to DDD's HCBS Community Integration Final Rule Best Practices for Providers. This webinar series with IDD providers will share their experiences in moving to and implementing person-centered practices consistent with HCBS Community Settings Final Rule. Hear from IDD providers from across the nation as they will offer examples and advice. We hope you enjoy this webinar series.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm so excited because we have a terrific lineup of speakers today. You don't just get to listen to me as you had to on the last few webinars, but we have some fantastic guests with us. Go ahead, Abby, to the next slide. So a quick rundown of what we're doing over the next 90 minutes. I'm going to run through a couple of quick slides, reminding everybody of the HCBS settings final rule. You guys hopefully know all this by heart by now, but we're going to just talk about it really quickly. And then I'm going to turn it over to our three guests. We have Lynne Seagle from Hope House in Virginia, Ann Bizak from Easter Seals, Hawaii, and Marian Fertola, I'm butchering names, I'm sorry, Celino from Values into Action in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, who are going to talk about their experiences as providers in developing and implementing person-centered services for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in a way that's compliant with the rule. With the goal being that you will learn a few things today and take away some ideas for your own practice. And as Abby mentioned, we will follow up and leave some time at the end for questions and answers. Next slide, please. So just a quick reminder, again, what is the final rule and why do we need to worry about it? The rule really talks about what is our home and community-based services and focuses on ensuring that each person's experience provides them the opportunity for community integration and participation and living the life that they want to live, which requires us to listen, provide individualized services, and support people to participate in the greater community in the ways that they participate in the community, including the opportunities to develop relationships and engage with people who do not have disabilities or who are not involved in services. Next slide, please. There are 7 key elements of the federal rule requiring home and community-based settings to operationalize these ideas. I'm not going to read through them again, but as the state is moving forward on ensuring that all settings are compliant, we are constantly wanting to remind everybody what the federal requirements are. Next slide, please. So as we've talked about in prior webinars, we are now in that middle phase here where we're working with providers to establish a baseline of compliance, where the providers have been offered evidence tools in which that allows them to assess their current compliance using a set of indicators. And really, we see this as an opportunity to look at what you're doing, help move from that category 1 to, category 2 to full compliance by the end of the year. And that this is an opportunity to learn and grow, improve practice, especially as we come out the other side of the pandemic and start thinking about how we're really going to be person-centered, how our practices are going to support participant experience that really reflects the values and preferences and needs of the people that we serve. Next slide, please. So again, just a quick reminder, we know that provider agencies are working on those evidence templates to come in the next few weeks. We will continue to work with the independent contractors and caregiver homes that will be turning in those templates on a rolling basis throughout 2021. And soon we'll be launching into remediation activities and supporting everyone to address everything from the policies, procedures, and practices to show that we can get to full compliance by the end of this year. So, and we have the prior webinars that are listed here are all on that DDD training website. So you can go back if you missed any of those, please take the time to review. And this webinar will be recorded and left on that website as well. Longtime friend and colleague, Lynne Seagle, who has taught me many things about how we can deliver services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in ways that are inherently consistent with the HCBS rule. Long before the HCBS rule even existed, she was doing this. So without any further ado, I turn the floor over to Lynne.
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning, everyone. So I'm the executive director, as you see, of Hope House Foundation, and I've been there for over 40 years. If you'd asked me that 40 years ago, would I still be at the same agency? I would have definitely said no, because I planned on changing the world in about 5 years. But I've learned a valuable lesson that it is a lifelong process to really change things for the better for people with disabilities. So 27 years ago, I can't see you, so I suspect that is before some of you were even born. We closed our last group home. We had 13 group homes in total, and it took us 10 years to close them all. I think we could do that quicker now, but you know, it was what it was. We didn't have any leadership to do this. We didn't have any examples, and we certainly had little encouragement. And there was no final rule, as Sharon mentioned. It really started when we naively asked 130 people who were living in group homes this question: do you like living here? And lo and behold, 130 people said yes. Well, that was odd. I mean, for 130 people on something so fundamental and personal as where you live, to all say they were happy. So we decided to change that question just ever so slightly. And we asked this: how do you want to live? And we got very different answers, but they fell into three major categories. The first and most dominant one was, I want my own home. I don't care how many times you tell me this is my home. I don't control the key. I don't control who lives here. I don't control who works here. Heck, some nights I don't even control what I watch on TV. This is not my home. This is your home. Two, I want a job. You know, one of those things that comes with a paycheck, that has a diversity in the workforce and not a group of people with carrying the same label, that has flexibility in a schedule. And three, we put this under the category of romance and friendship, but rest assured that it got expressed in a variety of ways. I want a girlfriend. I want a boyfriend. I want to get married. I want someone that is not paid to do this, to just call me up and say, let's catch a movie. Well, there really was no reason for us to change anything prior to learning this. We had beautiful group homes in middle and upper class neighborhoods, fine trimmed lawns, drapes that matched the fabric and the couches. Every day, people went off to the local day wasting program, stayed there from 8:30 to 3:15. Wednesday night was spaghetti night. Friday night was fish night. And coincidentally, everyone loved to go to bed early. We had no licensure violations, very low staff turnover. Families adored us, and the state held us up as a model. Well, once we asked that second question, we decided we would audit all our perfect program plans to see how many addressed people getting their own home, a real job, and unpaid relationships and places to belong and interest clubs to be part of in their life. Now, this was in 1984. When we did that audit of the 130 program plans, we had 0 addressing those 3 primary issues. So it begs the question, doesn't it? I mean, how is it possible to be an organization with no employee grievances, no licensure violations, families adore you, the state holds you up as a model, and not be addressing the major aspirations and wants of your biggest stakeholders? Well, I would suggest to you, not only is it possible, it's still rampant today across this country. But it's funny, once you know something is wrong, how much more effort it takes to keep pretending it's right. So we had a big agency-wide meeting and we said, where are we going to start? And we said, okay, let's not start with the romance and friendship. We've got a lot of people in group homes, so let's just not start there. And we were a residential provider, so we thought we didn't understand how to get people competitive employment. We have since changed our mind about that. So we really left with people having their own home. And in those days, we labeled homes based on what we perceived people's skill level was. So we decided we'd start with the high functioning group home. Again, this was 1984, because we just knew those folks would be so easy. That was our first lesson, that we really didn't know people very well at all. In fact, no matter how many times we said individual or how many times we wrote that on some form, we really didn't know any individuals. We only knew people in the context of the group that we supported them in. And when you support people congregately, you are very vulnerable to over-supporting or under-supporting, but you certainly don't individually support in a congregate arrangement. And of course, also congregate arrangements are not really set up so that people live with people or work in a group or work in a team that matches them, right? It's about filling slots. So we closed that first group home, learned a lot of lessons. I mean, critical lessons in that first year. We learned that people stopped going to the day center when they were given a choice. So we had 90% unemployment. We had 2 marriages in that first year. And I don't find closing group homes particularly romantic or seductive, but I think people could see possibilities. And we also found that those first 8 people, 7 of them got pets in the first year. No one could conceive of that when they were living in a congregate arrangement. So after that first year of closing the group homes, because we at that point had not decided that we were going to close them all, because we supported very complex people. So we were still thinking in those days that people had to earn their way to have their own home. So we took a year off and we studied all past civil rights movements in the United States. And we started with women and their quest for the right to vote. And we read a book collectively in our organization called The Yellow Wallpaper. We moved on then to Martin Luther King's civil rights movement for people of color. And we collectively read a book written by John Lewis called Walking with the Wind. And then we moved on to the LGBTQ community and their quest for the right to marry and to love who they loved. And at the end of that year, we learned something that changed the course from that point forward. And that is oppression and the principles of oppression look the same. They change groups, but the principles stay consistent. And those principles were alive and well in the disability industry. So that's when we said we're closing them all. And that was probably the hardest decision we made. Figuring out where people were going to live, figuring out what kind of supports they needed, helping people get connections, using technology, all of those things that came afterwards were much easier to figure out and to decide upon than that first decision, which was, we will no longer be a congregate provider. We won't do it. And we will take the stance that everyone with an intellectual or developmental disability can be supported in their own home with the right supports. So we also learned another thing, that cost and expenses, when you really pair them out individually, yes, think of a bell curve. Yes, there are people at the end of the spectrum that cost, you know, quite a bit. They have very complex needs. And there's people at the other end who get drop-in supports or whatever, have lots of relationships or connections that cost a lot less. And the majority of people in that middle thing need access to 24/7. Access, not someone with them 24/7, but access to that. We also found that the key factors of after safety and health was connection, places to belong. Now, COVID has put a different spin on that, but we have found that consistently since we closed the last group home, because people will say, you know, oh, but people will get lonely. You can be very lonely living with, you know, 2 people or 3 people that you don't want to live with. That can be real lonely as well. And it forced us to address the loneliness issue when people started getting their own places and complaints went up. And you'll find that with any oppressed group, that once freedom is truly achieved, criticism and complaints rise because they're able to. The space is there for them to do that. We also found that the use of technology, which, by the way, the baby boomers have really driven this because they have no intention of going into nursing homes. They want to age in place. So a lot of the smart home technology, which was so underutilized in this field and still is to a large extent, really created a lot of opportunities for connection, as well as opportunities for increased safety and health, and just really brought everyone into the 20th century. I mean, up until this COVID happened, the majority of people with intellectual disabilities in the United States didn't even have an email address. I mean, can you imagine that? But this field seemed fine with that. You know, to not even have that basic level of communication that we ourselves have had for decades. The third factor I would say that's significant is our management philosophy, which is participatory management. So in a nutshell, what that means is no decision shall be made that directly or indirectly affects you without first hearing what you think. It's a pretty simple concept, but a very progressive management system that, again, is not employed much in our industry. If you Google progressive and modern management systems, you'll be astounded that we don't come up. This industry doesn't come up. Most not-for-profits don't come up. Corporations come up. But I think participatory management was foundational because when staff are listened to, you know, and having your say is not democracy. You know, democracy is dangerous in an organization because you get in the habit of there's more of us that think like this than there are of you. Therefore, that must be just, it must be fair, it must be right. But really formulating an opinion and expressing that is that kind of collective dialogue that I think moved us forward. And it also transfers for direct support professionals. I'm listened to, I understand who I'm supposed to be listening to. So voice starts matching touch. Now, because it was so long ago that we changed the walls, right? That's what we originally did, was change the walls. And the service changes came later. So when the final rule came out, I mean, I don't want to act blasé, but we were like ho hum. I mean, it had no effect on us at all. Every single thing it said was already in place, and some of it by intention and some of it just because people lived in their own home, directed their own life, and it wasn't a lot to do. There was nothing to do, really. So what I've learned in talking with providers and speaking to others in the field is that we have three primary excuses for why we don't dismantle the system that it is quite old and not very modern now. And it starts with, you probably can guess this, money. And we have found that that is just a myth. You have to start with, how are you spending the money? You know, you have to really look at that hard. Where are you spending the money? And are you really getting what you're paying out for? Are you really getting value for people with disabilities? Two, as I said, when you support people individually, they're not a static cost. It goes up and down. You get a boyfriend, support needs go down. Your mother dies, support needs go up, right? People's lives move. It's not like this. Two, families. You know, families won't support this. Families won't be happy about this. Well, I've met hundreds and hundreds of family members in my career, and the vast majority want their kids safe and happy. I've never met a mother that says, hey, keep her miserable and risk her life every day. You know, it's about, how do you get there? And when you really partner with families on a true equal level, and I mean true equal level, we have found that you can kind of work out almost everything. And the third excuse is risk, which oftentimes when providers talk about risk, what they're really talking about is liability. And those two should not be confused. You cannot be a living, breathing human being and not have risk in your life. It is a fact, okay? You can't be living without some risk. Liability is very different than that. Liability is about blame, you know, and the two things that we have done to address liability is, one, buy liability insurance, and two, invest in your direct support workforce, invest in your direct support workforce, invest in your direct support workforce. And we have found liability to not be a reason at all. Now, I'm not saying that all risk is fine, but I am saying that, you know, sometimes bad things happen, not because a person has a disability, but because a drunk sailor runs a red light, you know? That is the fact of life. And when you really think about it, all these closed environments, from institutions to prisons to nursing homes, there's a lot of bad things that happen in those closed, secure environments. We have found that risk goes down when there's more eyes. When people are living in apartment complexes and neighborhoods with lots of other different people, a lot of eyes, and therefore less risk. So I look forward to any questions you might have. And
Lynne did such an amazing job. Thank you for joining us in our series of DDD's HCBS Final Rule for Community Integration, Best Practices for Providers webinar series. Next up, we will hear from Marion, from Values into Action all the way in Pennsylvania.